Hi folks, the purpose of this video today is to walk you through completing the adverse effect form. As a reminder for you, there is an exemplar and guidance form that's available within the School Psychologist's Corner inside the Special Education Google Classroom. That is what's showing on my screen right now. You can click into this exemplar and guidance form, which was completed by the psych team a little while back. The form looks slightly different now, but it's not so different that we needed to create a new form. There's also a slightly older document over here on the bottom right-hand side, which was created by the Department of Education to also just sort of list off for you the different types of evidence you can use for each question on the adverse effect form. So that is there for your use as well. There's also a newer section within the School Psychologist's Corner called When Do I Need That Form? To help you make a determination about when you might need a particular eligibility form, along with some reminders around when you might need to use an eligibility form in general. So generally speaking, this is initial referral meetings, re-eval meetings, or any time that you're making an eligibility determination. Maybe you had a new evaluation ordered or that the parent provided, something like that. An interesting note about the adverse effect form, or a couple interesting notes actually. One is, let me show you this document here. This is the table within that When Do I Need That Form link. The adverse effect form you can see here from this left-hand column is the most commonly used eligibility form by eligibility category. So you need to use the adverse effect form if the disability in question was autism, deafness, developmental delay, emotional disturbance, hearing impairment, etc. You can read them, so I won't do it for you. However, as a related note to that, the adverse effect form is also the only eligibility form that you do not need to fill out if the team has made the determination that the child does not qualify. So, for example, if the team had been questioning autism and determined that the child either did not have autism or perhaps they have autism but they don't need an IEP in order to benefit from their educational program, maybe they're going to be on a 504 or something like that, you do not need to complete the adverse effect form in that case. That is not the case for any other eligibility form, but for adverse effect, if the child doesn't qualify, you do not need to fill it out. I'm going to take you now to the exemplar and guidance form that I mentioned to walk you through how to complete the form. Note that I actually will pop back over into Adori just for a moment. The one thing that's changed, and this is something that makes your life a little bit easier, is that when you go in to complete, oh, for goodness sake, when you go in to complete the adverse effect form, oh, I can't use that test kiddo. Well, hopefully I can show you what I wanted to show you. Here we go. When you go in to complete the adverse effect form, you have to select initial eligibility or continuing eligibility / dismissal. You used to have to type in the reason you were using the form, but now it's just an easy check button. So, and then there's also a list here. This list is actually shorter, where the department is letting you know the categories where you do not need to use the adverse effect form. That list is very short. SLD, speech language, deaf blindness, those are the only three. Every other category requires the use of the adverse effect form. So this is a change from when the exemplar form was put together. Otherwise, however, it's more or less the same. So let's walk through each box quickly, just so that you have an idea of what needs to go in each one. There are some key words to look at in each box, even though sometimes, especially the first few boxes, seem like they might be asking for the same type of information. The first box asks for basically achievement information, academic achievement information on what they call nationally normed individually administered achievement tests. Or for younger students, there are some other things that you can use, but that's really the case for us. So nationally normed, individually administered. So what that generally means is something like a Wyatt or a Woodcock Johnson. You can see there's a list down here of all the things that might qualify. Sometimes in our district, it's Ames Webb. The YCAT is one you might see on some old evaluations. Our previous academic administrator, Jan, used to use the YCAT, but that's not something that we currently own in the district. But here, these are some things that you might see. The FAM and the FAR are still things that we use every now and again, key math sometimes, you know. So these are things that you might see and might qualify as information here. Note that when you enter that information, there are some important pieces you need to include. Those are things such as the evaluator and the name or degree or credential of the evaluator, the name of the test and the subtest. So we're not just going to say on the Woodcock Johnson 4, we're going to say which specific subtests. So for this student, it was math calculation, math problem solving, letter word identification. Similarly, if you were using something like progress monitoring data from Ames Webb, you'd still say the name of the teacher who collected that information and the approximate date that that information was collected. Certainly if it's progress monitoring data, it's going to be over a span of time versus just one shot in time, like up here with, you know, Marie's information. You also want to include what the specific scores were and what that means. So you're not just going to say the student scored a 79, because that there's no context for what that 79 means. You're going to say that the student scored in the below average range, and that was the specific score that they received. That sort of information is going to keep coming up across boxes. So box number 2, which seems like it's asking for some pretty similar information, and it is similar but not the same, asks for scores on nationally normed group administered achievement tests. So that's when, of course, multiple students are taking a test at the same time. That's usually in our district things like NUIA, PSATs, or SATs. It is not MEAs, even though those are group administered. That will come back up in another box. And there is a specific reason for that, not just people being difficult. Similar to the above box, you're going to include the scores and the meaning of the scores. You don't generally need to include an evaluator here because this is usually something that the student has taken with just a proctor in the room, which is usually just a teacher. And we don't need to try to track down who was the proctor each time. These are tests that are less reliant on having someone who is actually qualified to give a test per se. So all you need to include are the scores, the name of the test, and what the scores mean. This becomes especially important with tests like these because, of course, they're all on a different scale. A NUIA score and a PSAT score, the numbers don't mean the same thing. And with things like NUIA scores, the numbers mean very different things depending on the grade level of the student. So that's something that we want to make sure we have included some interpretation for. Box 3 specifically asks about things prepared by the school district or sometimes given by the parent that reflect academic or functional performance deficits. For our purposes, this is things like recent grades. So, and specifically in our district, we need this to be stuff that's standards based in this box. So grades in our district can generally be used. Sometimes not if a student comes from a different district. So if you have questions about that, just touch base with one of us on the site team and we can help you with that. You want to include the name of the class. So not just that the student, you know, failed 5 classes, but which specific classes did they fail? Because that's meaningful. You can also use, again, functional performance here. So this is things like the ABIS or the Vineland. Sometimes some subscales on the BASC. Again, we can help you as psychologists navigate that if it's needed. If it's a class grade, then you're going to include the name of the class and the specific grade and what it means. If it's an ABIS or Vineland, similar to stuff you've seen above. So the evaluator's name, their credential, the test or subtest names and scores and what they mean. Box 4 is where we would put MEA scores. So those are the primary measure we tend to use in this box. Sometimes you can use TC writing prompts. We tend to stick more to MEAs. but you can if it's needed, especially if writing is an area that's particularly in question. Make sure you include subject areas, dates, scores, and meanings. Box 5 specifically asks for criterion referenced assessments. We have fewer of those. When we do use them, they tend to be things like the ABLES, if you've heard of that. Sometimes the Brigance. Sometimes kiddos in CDS have some Brigance scores that we can put in here. Some OT and PT evals, especially some of the things that Marlena Ramu, our physical therapist, gives, are sometimes criterion reference things, but a lot of OT stuff is also norm referenced. So if you have questions about that, you can certainly ask the therapist or ask someone from the psych team, was this criterion referenced or was it norm referenced? Because if it's norm referenced, it would need to go somewhere else. Box 6 is a little bit more vague. They're just asking here about student work products, language samples, portfolios, basically the things that you would observe or come in contact with in a typical school day. So this can be a little bit more anecdotal. Things like what you've observed in the classroom, if you have any hard data you can share on classroom work products, such as, the student on classroom spelling tests has only been able to write 50% of words correctly, something like that. But you can also note anecdotal reports on things like the quality of the content of classwork, neatness of handwriting, how much work they're completing if they're engaging in work refusal instead of completing their work. Try to make it as recent and objective as you can, even though it's more observational in nature. So that's things like, instead of saying the student's handwriting is very messy, you might say, compared to other peers, Jay's handwriting is less legible, something like that. Box 7 specifically asks for disciplinary evidence. This obviously can come from Swiss data. That counts as disciplinary evidence. So if you have documented office discipline referrals, you want to indicate how many and the primary reasons for those. So you see here this exemplar sentence is that Jay has 7 documented ODRs for noncompliance and aggression, and the time frame during the current school year. So if he's a senior in high school, his ODRs from kindergarten perhaps don't matter quite so much right now. You can also include rating scales that specifically measure behavioral concerns. In that case, similar to the data we talked about above, you want to make sure you include the evaluator's name, the date, specific scales that were elevated, and just how elevated were they. Sometimes we have at risk, sometimes we have elevated, sometimes we have very elevated. So you want to make sure that you include what that means. If relevant, you can also include the specific numerical scores as well. And you also want to indicate who provided the ratings when you're reporting on rating scales. Was it a teacher? Was it a parent? Was it self-report? That's all really important information as well. And there's a list here of potential rating scales that you might include. Rating scales are notoriously difficult to parse out for the adverse effect form, and part of the reason for that is because there are so many different places they can go. So the BASC in particular has subscales that could go here as behavioral or disciplinary related information. They could also go in the box I referenced above, asking about functional information. They could also go in box 9, relative to social or emotional deficits. So I encourage you, if you're working through this form without a psychologist, to be very careful in your reading of which box you're putting things in. I've tried to include here for you the specific scales you might put here. So inattention, hyperactivity, aggression, rule breaking, anger, defiance, conduct problems are all things that we would put in box 7. This is as opposed to, and I'll pop down to box 9 for a minute, this is as opposed to scales like anxiety, depression, social problems, peer relations, withdrawal, etc. Those things would all come down here in box 9 because they are more social, emotional in nature. Sometimes this is hard for us because I think in our district we do a good job of looking at the child as a whole, and we don't always break down their behavior in this way. But unfortunately, the department makes us do it. They really want to see where exactly did the students' challenges lie. So and I have also